It's now time for Global Insights, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. The June 1st election saw a massive ruling party victory, except for a few traditional partisan strongholds. President Yoon's People Power Party snapped up most of the 17 mayoral and governor posts, including those of the country's biggest cities and regions, including Seoul, Busan, Incheon and Daegu. And at the National Assembly, former presidential candidates Cheol-soo and Jae-myung won constituencies in the outskirt regions of Seoul. To break down the results and discuss the outcome, we have in the studio with us today Mason RICHEY, professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Lovely to see you in our studio. And we're also joined by Hee-eun, professor of law at the Handong International Law School. Thank you so much for joining us online. Well, my first question to you, Professor RICHEY. Now, we saw a massive sweeping victory for the ruling People Power Party, of course. And, well, this was seen as sort of a first indicator of what Korean people think about the new Yoon administration. So, in that sense, what do you think this really indicates about public sentiment?
So in the first place, like many of these kinds of local and municipal and regional elections in countries all over the world, frequently there's a sort of halo effect in these local elections that comes from the national elections, and we're going to see something kind of similar in France actually this upcoming weekend with the legislative elections following just after Macron's election. And so I think frequently this is a sort of first chance to see how the population thinks that a winning presidential candidate is doing in their new job. So there's this kind of halo effect, and I think in that regard what we see is that the Yoon administration, I think, has picked up some momentum. He did win a very close election, razor-thin majority over Jae-myung, and so I think this is a sort of first confirmation that the overall voting public thinks he's done a relatively decent job so far. I think he's getting some momentum from the summit with President Biden. I think he's getting some momentum from the special budget that was just passed. Looking forward, I think people are maybe assuming that there might be some reason to be optimistic economically going forward. So I think that's on the one side. On the other side, obviously the Democratic Party suffered very heavy losses, and I think that this is in part due, I think, just to a sense that the public is, kind of sending the final message to the DP that they need to reform and that they need to get away from the infighting within the party, and that they need to rejuvenate and be ready in 2024 and then for the next presidential election in 5 years.
Right, so maybe some time for soul searching for the DP that did suffer very heavy losses. And now over to you, Professor Lee. Now, I wonder what you made of the results. What do you think the results really indicate about what the South Korean people want?
I'd just like to echo what Professor RICHEY was saying. I think clearly his last point about the Democratic Party, this really is a judgment on them in part, because I think in this case, you see, many years of the Moon administration, and then of course Lee Jae-myung is sort of the standard bearer for very progressive politics with respect to Korean politics. And I think the voters basically handed the death blow to that particular form of the Democratic Party. And I think there's going to be a lot of infighting going forward because you have a younger generation, famously now within the last several weeks, of people calling out the older generation in the party to sort of step down and take a younger group of people to lead the party. And so I think that's one clear indication of this election. And as well as I think maybe in terms of just turnout generally, there was certainly less than you saw in the presidential election, which is understandable, as well as in 2018. And partly probably is that's due to voter fatigue as well. So we have a major election in March and then of course turn around the same year, which is unusual given the facts of the election cycle, that you have this election as well. So I think all in all, it was a resounding victory for the ruling party, but against a judgment against the Democratic Party.
And Professor Lee, now the Seoul mayoral race, very interesting. It seemed like a no-brainer really, but still, even so, it was a very impressive win for Oh Se-eun. It's going to be his fourth term as Seoul mayor. And well, what do you make of the results then for the Seoul mayor race? And do you think the council seats elected will also work in Oh's favour?
So as you mentioned, fourth term, which is unprecedented, obviously. That's because he had to step down during his second term, and then he then came back about 10 years later after Park Won-soon, committed suicide, and then, of course, there was a by-election for the Seoul mayoral seat. And so I think this obviously will propel him to the national spotlight, given, of course, it's just Seoul. But naturally, I think he becomes sort of the leading candidate for the next presidential cycle. And so within the, I think, People Power Party, he probably is going to sort of take the helm in terms of this future direction of the party. Now, there are, of course, others in the party that will vie for that seat as well. But I think it is an impressive win, and given where he had lost and he had resigned, basically resigned from office, it's a stunning comeback, and then also just reasserting himself within the national scene as being Seoul mayor. And also, this, in terms of what his initiatives and going forward, I think with the Seoul City Council, I think he has the possibility of doing a lot with respect to his term. And so if he plays this well, he'll put himself in the leading position then when the time comes for the next presidential election.
Yeah, the next presidential election. So that's what I want to ask you about, Professor RICHEY. What do you think was Oh's appeal that won him a fourth term in the Seoul mayoral office? And do you think this is really going to become a stepping stone for the next presidential election? Yeah,
so I think his appeal is probably not so much on specific policies. I think for a conservative, he gives out a relatively modern and contemporary and sort of moderate vision for what conservatives can offer to Seoulites. I think he does also get some credit for some of the welfare policies that he's backed, so I think that's probably contributed to it as well. He does have some specific visions in terms of trying to bring tourism back to Seoul and some measures in that regard. So obviously, those whose livelihood here in Seoul depends on tourism, and depends on greater exchange internationally, I think are probably interested in the vision that he offers. Whether or not this mayoral term for him is going to be the stepping stone to the presidency is, of course, a very interesting question. Historically, we know that this has often been considered the case, and I guess sort of Lee Myungbaks as a conservative is sort of the paradigm, I guess, for how it is that people look at conservatives using the Seoul mayorship as a stepping stone towards becoming president. But between now and the next presidential election cycle, there's a lot of time to elapse, so he has plenty of time to make progress, plenty of time to have problems. Plenty of infighting will happen within the PPP itself. There will be plenty of jockeying for position, as Professor Lee just mentioned. And let's not forget, too, that just a few years ago, we were looking at the DP as ascendant and the Conservative Party as in terminal decline, and now the tables have totally switched. So what's going to happen in the next presidential election is really anyone's guess.
Right, so 4 or 5 years, that's centuries in political terms, I'll say. A lot can happen between now and then. And my next question to you, Professor Lee, moving over to the Gyeonggi-do province. Very exciting morning for all of us, I'm sure. They kept us on the edge of our seats until the end, until we heard that Kim Dong-yeon of the Democratic Party of Korea, that he swept up the governor post for the Gyeonggi-do province region. And well, what do you think was the winning candidate's appeal, and how do you see Mr. Kim's career trajectory going forward?
Well, as you referred to, the exit polling showed that Kim Eun-hye was going to win the election, and so he pulled it out at the last minute. But as far as winning the Gyeonggi province election, the governorship, I mean, this was Lee Jae-myung's position. Obviously, he was the governor of Gyeonggi province, and so obviously, I think the DP had strong a base in the Gyeonggi region. And so I think in some sense, the fact that it was so relatively that close, I think shows something about, again, a little bit about maybe Lee Jae-myung's leadership as part of the election, election committee that was supposed to take the DP, the Democratic Party, sort of recover from the presidential election. But as far as Kim Dong-yeon is concerned, he obviously is going to have a very bright future within the Democratic Party because he came out sort of as the sort of lone figure, I think, outside of the strongholds for the Democratic Party. And so he's going to have the best position, I think, within the party, I think, going forward. Now, Lee Jae-myung, of course, will have a role to play, given his win in the National Assembly election. But I think this will be an interesting question and issue going forward for the Democratic Party about his leadership within the party. And then, of course, Kim Eun-hye, she lost this election, again, very, very close. And so given that it was a very close election, I don't see her prospects necessarily dimming per se. I think she will maybe, of course, resurrect her career potentially going forward, and she'll have a role to play, of course, within the People Power Party as well. But I think the dynamics have changed within the Democratic Party, and you're going to see, I think, really a new leadership going forward for the Democrats.
And well, Professor Lee, for Lee Jae-myung, of course, it was a pretty safe electoral sort of run for him, where he ran, as he enjoyed huge popularity there while he was running for president. And well, now that he's secured that National Assembly seat, and as well as and so did Cheol-soo, really, they both secured their parliamentary positions. What do you think comes next for these former presidential candidates?
Well, as I was talking about for Lee Jae-myung, I mean, I think he has an uphill battle for, I think, leadership within the party because, I mean, he was the standard bearer for the party in the presidential election, and he lost. Although, of course, it was a very razor-thin majority that Yoon won, but he did lose. And so I think with the overall results of the losses in the Democratic Party, I think a lot of people are going to be doing soul searching within the party, but also soul searching with respect to the leadership. And so I think Lee Jae-myung faces a really tough road to climb with respect to, I think, reclaiming leadership within the party. Now, for An Cheol-soo, I think his prospects are better. He obviously, clearly won his election handily, but also, given his position within the party as supporting Yoon sort of towards the end of the presidential election, I think he puts himself in a pretty good position, I think, with respect to the party because he has his own base. But also, I think people will look to him as providing leadership within the party itself. And it will be very intriguing to see between An, between the party leadership itself, as to what role An will play in these new dynamics.
And Professor RICHEY, as we tend to get very caught up in the, the infighting and just the bickering between politicians and local agendas here, we tend to talk about foreign residents here as perhaps an afterthought. And despite the growing number of foreign residents in South Korea who are eligible to vote in the local elections, we've seen a continuing decline in the turnout. And well, how do you think the foreign residents here in South Korea can be better represented, and how can we really endorse the kind of agendas and issues that they care about?
Yeah, that's obviously a great question, and I'll sort of start my answer by saying I think it's great that Korea allows this possibility to non-citizens to vote. I think that that's an important part of the civic democracy here in this country. That's balanced out, by the other hand, on the other hand, by a small story I can tell you from someone I was speaking with just a few days ago, actually, in the context of this election. And she said there's a sort of vision or a sort of story, I think it might have come from a movie, where she said, Koreans often look at immigrants here in Korea as arriving at the table with a spoon and want to eat the meal that the Koreans have already prepared. And so there's a sense, I think, that's a sort of general unwelcome for certain immigrant populations here, particularly ones who are perhaps not of European ethnicity, or ones who perhaps don't have higher paying jobs. So I think that a sort of increase in the understanding on Koreans in general that immigration is important for this country economically moving forward, that immigrants shouldn't just have a one-way street towards integration into Korean society, but Koreans need to come the other way too. I think that would make a difference in a sort of more general sense of welcome for immigrants here. And I think that's an important first step. Beyond that, with specific respect to elections, frankly speaking, better communications. I mean, even for Koreans, again, talking with this Korean person I know yesterday, a few days ago, she said that, they get, big, thick packets of very detailed information about all the candidates. It's just hard to figure out, who stands for what and what the actual policy platforms are, and to what extent does it even matter, these elections, given that so much here is decided, on a national level and through the central government. So I think, cutting through some of the complexity on that, I think would help a lot, not only with immigrants here, but also with Koreans, and getting higher turnout. And then I think the last thing is, perhaps in some places, targeted advertising, to certain immigrant populations, perhaps with, facing language editions of some of these pamphlets, easier versions of it to understand, where you have a Korean version and then an English version or a Chinese version or a version of a language from Southeast Asia or somewhere like that. I think that might help as well.
Right, and there's definitely been growing calls for the Immigration Office, the Ministry of Law, to really look at this immigration issue from a very multifaceted approach rather than just a one-way sort of approach, as you just mentioned. And well, in terms of turnout, though, Professor Lee, the turnout for the local elections this year was actually very low. It was much lower than the last race in 2018, and it was the second lowest rate on record for local elections. So what do you think really explains this phenomenon? Why weren't people getting out and voting?
Well, I think because we had the usual situation of, we had a presidential election already in March. And so I think given the attention that was paid on the presidential election, just several months later having these elections, I think it leads to some I think sense from among voters, as to coming out again to make this vote. But also I think beyond just that issue of just low turnout, I think it has to also do probably with a statement with respect to the parties themselves. With respect to the Democratic Party, again, I think some people may have sat out this election, sort of as a means to just communicate their sort of overall dismay as to where the party is going, because as we saw in the presidential election, the populace was pretty evenly split between conservatives and progressives, and so I think you have to think that if the progressives were able to get more voters out into the voting booth, they may have seen greater success. But probably also as well, that is, I think, as Professor Richey mentioned earlier in the broadcast, the halo effect and sort of the momentum that was built by the People Power Party. And I think the turnout itself, I think, is a reflection of sort of maybe giving this administration, the Yoon administration, its mandate to sort of go forward, knowing that there's a significant population that is maybe wary of his policies, but a general hope and willingness to sort of think about the future and be a little more optimistic.
Well, I'm afraid this is where we're going to have to wrap up this interview. That was Hee-eun, Professor of Law at Handong International Law School. Thank you for joining us all the way from Pohang online. And Mason Ritchie, Professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you so much for being in studio with us today.
Thanks for having me.